Good morning and welcome. It's Thursday, September the 4th, the start of what will feel like the longest weekend for Angela Rayner. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. So we can say this morning that the Cabinet Minister for Housing hasn't paid the amount of housing tax that she should have done. Quite the sentence, quite the development. In a handful of days, the Deputy Prime Minister will discover if her political career can continue or is about to come to a crashing halt. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne, the podcast that gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in about 20 minutes.
And even yesterday, Sam, there wasn't a sniff of what was going to emerge. Wednesday was going to be all about the budget, remember? And it did indeed turn out to be set for November the 26th. Rachel Reeves gave us the date and told us on social media she'd be putting money back into our pockets when most economists think the multi-billion black hole means that tax rises and money will be trickling out of our pocket holes. The government was highlighting a meeting today of the European allies to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine as Volodymyr Zelensky sits down in Paris with Emmanuel Macron and then a decisive call with Donald Trump. But it's turned out to be a very domestic story about houses that gripped Westminster.
That's right. This episode is going to be all about Angela Rayner. I don't think there's any other anything else listeners would really want. And I also think that bluntly, on the government side, on the Labour side, pretty much the conversation around the government, the narrative of government, and to a certain extent, the operation at the top of government is going to be on pause until this is resolved, which it could be maybe by Monday. Laurie Magnus, in whose fate Angela Rayner's political career rests, tends to take under a week to do his deliberations and deliver his reports to the Prime Minister. So I think it should be intense, painful, but relatively brief. The first sniff that there was anything up yesterday was when I walked in the office and I heard Laurie Magnus's name being mentioned, which was a bit confusing because I didn't realise he was on the news agenda at all. And then Angela Rayner's face popped up on pretty much every screen in the office. This is kind of what happens when we're taping an interview. And she was, of course, talking to our Beth Rigby. And her face was suddenly everywhere. And you listened to the recording being taped and sort of your jaw dropped, and it was all made public, the sort of package, the press release, the interview, all of that dropped at 11:30, and frankly the rest is kind of quickly written history.
Gosh, so you had first sight of that interview. More on the Raina story in just a moment, but it is September, as the rain-lashed windows keep reminding me. It's conference season, and to get us going for that, Reform UK are heading to Birmingham for their two-day meetup starting tomorrow. The leader's speech, Nigel Farage, of course, will be hot-footing it back from Washington for his starring moment. That will be at 4 p.m. on Friday, so I suppose we better do something about that, Sam.
That's right. So a couple of hours after that, you will get in your feeds what we're calling a debrief episode. And if you put on notifications on your feed for your podcast, that will just pop up with a notification and you will see that it has arrived. Now, I want to just link the conference season to the fate of Angela Rayner because there's a little curiosity. Next week, after Reform, next week's conference is the TUC conference, I think down in Brighton. And you would normally expect Angela Rayner or Keir Starmer to play a star turn at that. And I had in the back of my mind thought it was Angela Rayner's turn, but no, not this year. The main act on stage is Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, and the TUC dinner with the union bosses, well, that's going to be hosted by Ed Miliband. I don't think this is and I'm told this isn't a last-minute substitution, but Angela Rayner, one of her functions in government is to be something of a darling of the union movement, although relations with Unite have soured recently. But I am intrigued that she's not there doing that next week. So all of that is something of a curiosity. Anyway, on with the substance, Anne.
So the announcement by Angela Rayner in that podcast interview all dropped at 11:30 a.m. yesterday, half an hour before PMQs. The headline's pretty simple to grasp, isn't it? That after days of stories about her property and tax affairs, the Deputy Prime Minister and Housing Secretary has admitted that she paid around £40,000 too little tax, stamp duty in this case, when buying an apartment in Hove. Now, she blames bad legal advice, that refers to her tax and trust setups that she already had. She's referred herself to the ministerial investigator, and within days, maybe as soon as Monday, Laurie Magnus, will come back with a report and we will know Angela Rayner's fate.
I think listeners to this podcast quite like us if we take you one level deeper. So let me explain, because the headline is simple, the details and the technicalities are not. But just give me 45 seconds to see if I can whiz you through them. So this is all about how much stamp duty Angela Rayner should have paid on her new property in Hove. And how much stamp duty you pay depends on whether your new 800,000 seaside holiday flat in Hove near Brighton should be regarded for tax purposes as your main property or your second property, because the rate of how much stamp duty you pay changes whether it's your first or not your first home, and that's the difference. It's about £40,000 is the difference. Now, it appears that she initially thought she should pay the lower rate because what we maybe think Angela Rayner maybe thinks of as her traditional main home, her Manchester home that she bought with her now ex-husband, which is where her disabled son lives, was put in a trust, and then she sold a stake in that trust to pay for the Hove flat. So in her mind, she isn't now an owner of that Manchester property in some senses, although her name remains on the deeds as a trustee. So it is complicated. Initially, she got legal advice, it appears, from multiple sources, saying that she should pay the stamp duty at the lower rate because of the arrangements to do with the trust in Manchester. But in the last few days, notably only after the newspapers and other media started investigating, she got new tax advice and was told that this original advice was wrong. And so she has said that she's going to pay the £40,000, and she possibly could face a fine from HMRC of about £12,000 because, according to tax experts, she could come under she could be accused of non-compliance with tax law, which is a pretty dreadful situation for a housing secretary and a deputy prime minister. Anyway, that is the nitty gritty of it. So you can see the complexity. She's blaming bad legal advice, and really, that's what her fate hinges on. She's got to show, I presume, the legal advice to Laurie Magnus if it exists in written form, and her defense will be she was simply following the inaccurate advice of a lawyer, legal advice we haven't seen, in which case I think a lot of people would try and make the case in the Labour Party that defense was reasonable. However, if that legal advice was in some way caveated or hedged and suggested that Angela Rayner could pay the lower amount of stamp duty but had to accept the risk that this wasn't a foolproof scheme, or if that original legal advice was on the basis of in some way inaccurate or incomplete information about the trust, well, at that point, I think things get a lot more sticky. So that is, I think, where the nuts and bolts of this investigation will get to pretty quickly.
That is Sam Coates on Just a Minute without repetition, hesitation, etc. Let me see if I can have a go at it. I agree with you, Sam. I think a lot depends on the wording here of Laurie Magnus's report into this tangle of the stamp duty, the tax implications, and the trust. And as Angela Rayner explained to Beth Rigby, she was trying to provide security for her son, but there's then also the judgment question of the interaction with that trust to buy the property in Hove. Let's not forget, this is not just about why she set up the trust in the first place for her son who is disabled. It's really what follows, and therefore there's also a judgment issue here as well as a legal one. You can see if you're on Team Rayner right now, you don't really want to dwell on that. You want to dwell on, was the advice accurate or not? And she's saying she received the wrong professional opinion, as you point out. And it was only last week when fresh legal opinion concluded that she should have paid more stamp duty. But you do come down to the fact that it was very unlikely that she would have gone and sought that had she not been in the eye of the storm in the media for this. And a lot of people will probably feel that they had to go out and defend her, only to find that she had to go and get advice somewhere else. So it doesn't feel as if her judgment and the handling of this has been very solid. Now, Kate Ferguson, writing The Sun today, is pointing out that this is already impacting when and what the next reshuffle will be. And this would be, as we take the lens out a bit here, my bigger point as well, that this is starting to impact government business. it is not only that Keir Starmer has to give his full support to Angela Rayner, which he's done in a very full-throated, sort of fulsome way. I'm proud of her, etc., etc. That may partly to placate the Labour Party and people who are Labour Party who are rather fonder of Angela Rayner than they are of Keir Starmer, but he has to use up some capital doing that. And Sam, it does seem to affect what happens next. We were supposed to be in phase 2 of the great Starmer reset, weren't we? This is what we were supposed to be talking about this week. Well, that's been blown out of the water. And also everything from when the reshuffle happens, maybe Kate Ferguson's story is right and it was going to be sooner than many of us thought. Maybe it wasn't, but either way, her role is now in play in a way that it wasn't. So this new revitalized number 10 team has got a completely altered board on which it needs to operate.
Just across the board, this couldn't have been a worse development for Keir Starmer's attempt to reset everything. There's no doubt about that. And it is a moment of actual big peril, not just for Angela Rayner, but for the whole Starmer project, for reasons I'll come to in a moment. But it is quite clear that number 10 and Angela Rayner's team are trying to fight this out, not just with Laurie Magnus, but in the court of public opinion. They're running these arguments about her family circumstances. They're running arguments about how she is attacked by critics for her class and her background and her approach as a minister. But for me, there's a really big point. If scrape away the specifics, what is a minister's job, Anne? A minister's job is to sit and take professional advice and come to a judgment. And here, that is exactly what Angela Rayner did in her own personal life and has been found wanting. What she was doing in her private life is what she does in her day job. You take, as Deputy Prime Minister, as a Secretary of State, as a Cabinet Minister, you take professional advice and you have to come to a determination, whether it's right, whether it's sensible, whether there's a risk involved, and make a judgment about the politics of it. Simply saying it was the lawyer what did it is complicated because you can't just say it was the civil servant what did it in your day job. Okay, so that's one part of it. And the other thing is, we have had tax avoidance, tax evasion, tax stories, for decades. And the go-to excuse of everybody was and is, it's the fault of my lawyer. And the determination of the tax authorities and actually public opinion, if you are a comedian or if you're a footballer, is to give that very short shrift. So the quite hard task that that they're trying to execute in number 10 and amongst those around Angela Rayner, by making this into an issue of emotion in some cases and of personality, is to say, that way that we treat cases like that, well, you should make an exception for Angela Rayner, which, given she is the housing secretary, is quite hard. And that is, so there is an attempt. There is no doubt, however, that the politics absolutely demands that they do this, because I talked to loads of Labour figures yesterday, and all of them want Angela Rayner to survive. In some part, not because they are massive fans of her, but because the idea of unpicking the top level of this government, that bit of the top level of this government, when frankly it was the Rachel Reeves bit that's been worried about for so long, unpicking that because Angela Rayner brings with her a certain type of voter and a certain type of MP, and unstitching that from the Keir Starmer sort of internal coalition will be very tricky. But if he can sack her as deputy prime minister, sure, but she's also the democratically elected deputy leader of the Labour Party. And whilst she could lose the government job and sit on the back benches and just cause trouble, she could also resign the deputy leadership and there'll be a contest. And nobody last night could think of anything more gruesome than trying to hold a contest amongst the Labour Party, internal talking shop and turn inwards in order to work out. And a successful candidate would probably end up being somebody who ran on a ticket of, I'm going to speak truth to Keir Starmer and keep him true to Labour values because he's gone adrift, right? Any contest would be a disaster for Keir Starmer. You don't want that. Work backwards, and actually the safest thing to do politically is to keep her in her job.
Really interesting. I wonder if it's also a bit of a recipe for a blind spot. Because if you follow that logic, you can only come to that conclusion. It seems to me that there are two ways, well, more than two ways, but two ways broadly that this could go. And one that we haven't yet reflected perhaps enough is the, in fairness to Angela Rayner case, that maybe Laurie Magnus will simply conclude that she behaved appropriately and that proportionate. I take your point there, Sam, that you are a minister and you take advice and use your judgment. But this was a complex situation with this trust for her son, and he may conclude that this is not her area of professional expertise, and within the bounds of what an informed layperson could be expected to know, that she behaved appropriately. The funny thing is, on the camera, I can just see Sam like furrowing his brow at this.
Okay, let me jump in. Please let me jump in on that.
Well, I will, as long as you'll let me continue.
I will do. Is Angela Rayner an expert in housing law? Is she an expert in planning law? The job of a minister is not to be the world expert in areas. You take professional advice and you come to a determination based on the politics. That is the thing that she has failed to do in this instance. And I just draw the parallel once more between, if she messed up and it is not reasonable to expect her to have a lot of expertise, well, not having a lot of expertise is what you expect a cabinet minister of a cabinet minister who has to make a determination on every single bit of policy that affects voters. So I struggle with that argument.
You've made your point, caller, as we as we say on the phone-ins. I'm just to get my morning brutality on here. My point was really more that if that is the way that Laurie Magnus phrases a conclusion, whether you agree with it or not, Sam Coates, that I think would allow her, it wouldn't exactly in one bound be free, but a win is a win. You know what it reminds me of, because Angela Rayner was also heavily involved, was that trip to County Durham in the pandemic, and were they having a beer after a hard day's meetings about how to win big in County Durham and take it back from the Tories, or were they actually having a bit too much fun in the evening that you shouldn't have been having and meeting over drinks? Well, in fact, that really helped Keir Starmer when that ruling came in and backed Labour's version of that. So I'm pointing out that just could happen, because I think we haven't reflected it. But where I do also, I think, have a bit of sensitivity here, and you brought it up, is the class defence of Raina. The idea she's targeted because critics can't stand a working class northerner with some sort of vavavrum in a senior job. And this is clearly the line that the Raina Defence Force, Peter Kyle was out there yesterday, Thangam Debonair and others are using. And she herself, in the interview with Beth, deployed some pathos about her situation. And some of that, everything is instrumentalized in politics, and when your back's against the wall, you will fight with everything you have, and this is a very Labour weapon. But I wondered whether it can be overplayed as well, because it's one thing to say, I have this complex situation, divorce, a child I needed to look after. You didn't have to go into this sort of arrangement about the Hove apartment, the decision, as you say, the judgment call on when and why she was doing that. When she's in office, when we know the government's already in a bad situation, I think the personal and the political got a bit kind of detached from each other in this case, in Raina's mind. And I think if she had her time again, she would sequence it differently. She said any parent would understand what she'd done, but would everyone, in inverted commas, understand the complexity of these property switch arounds? So that's why the phrasing matters so much, I think, that Magnus will come up with. Will it be, well, yeah, you made a bit of a mess, in which case you could argue some time out would be good, but there would be no barrier to her coming back. I mean, that's the other, that has been deployed before, right, in these circumstances. As you say, she would keep that deputy leader of the Labour Party, she'd forfeit the ministerial roles. But either way, it's a mess, isn't it? Because decoupling the role of Angela Rayner's role was built layer on layer to give her lots of power, lots of influence, and keep her happy. Once you start to take away bits of that, you could see it could get a bit unhappy.
You raise the issue of sentiment in politics. It's a funny thing. Often sentiment is particularly turned on when the TV cameras are on, and is particularly absent behind the scenes. One conversation yesterday, a brief conversation with a new NTEC MP, went straight to, I asked what they thought, and they went, well, if we're being honest, this rules her out from the next leadership contest, doesn't it? So the the go-to reaction of people is very different, and they do switch it on a bit for the cameras, and it's not always quite what they think behind the scenes. I'm going to stick my neck out and tell you what I think is going to happen on the basis of the current facts. I think she survives. If this issue is judged is the determining one, right? I think on balance, she clearly thinks she has a good legal defense, and her entire political survival depends on it. And so she I think has some degree of confidence. She's intimating she has some degree of confidence that she can show she was badly advised. And if that is the case, then I think Keir Starmer, as the front page of the Times says, as every single Labour person that I spoke to thinks, they wanted to survive. She has to survive politically. She will survive. But Angela Rayner is a risk taker, a big risk taker on and I have thought this for years, on an unwise scale. Whether it is, I think she felt kind of Teflon after she survived Keir Starmer's attempt to demote her in 2021 in that botched reshuffle, and she feels like she has for some time felt like she has a sort of Teflon skin, and there are, you know, there are things that, people tell me there are things that she has done that you wouldn't normally do as a politician. There are risks that she has taken, even just this situation involving 3 properties. Everybody talks about the first property in Manchester and the third property in Hove, but what fascinates me is the second property, which is the fact that she was living in a flat in central London, and then all of a sudden was able to stop paying rent and move into a Grace and Favour property in December of last year in Admiralty Arch. That's quite her. She doesn't pay rent on a place in London like anybody else. She thought she could suck up any political pain from getting a freebie property and live in that as Deputy Prime Minister. That's an interesting sort of risk to do. And, she has been pretty flamboyant in the way she conducts elements of her sort of public persona, the sort of Ibiza videos from last year. She leans into, I'm a bit of a risk taker, I'm a normal person, but she does things, I think, in doing so, that take you quite close to a political danger line. If this is judged just on the facts of the trust, I think she survives. If it's open season on Angela Rayner, and there are undoubtedly media enemies that are going to go for her in the coming days, over the weekend, the Sunday papers, and they find another risk that they have taken, I am less sure about her survival.
I'm also less sure about really what Keir Starmer thinks, and you are right to point out that they have this history there. And yes, they've been bound together, but I don't think that they are very close in the sense of they wouldn't have chosen each other. That's not the way this Labour leadership team came into being. She did survive an attempt to demote her, and that perhaps to explain the psychology of what you call this risk taking, and there's this accumulation of power and roles, and more people that she brings around her into her roles just at the time the government's trying to get the head count down. There is often an inconsistency there, but I think she thinks such a thing. You see it as Teflon. I think that she thinks, and this maybe does fit a bit with her backstory and her narrative, that she's always in some way, she has to watch out for herself, and that she's to do, to get her defence in there. She doesn't really trust a lot of people in the Labour elite, and that she therefore sort of behaves in that way. And I think that maybe explains some of these behaviours. The question is that a good enough excuse or explanation as this rolls through? Maybe slightly differently to you, I think the housing secretary role, I think she can survive, in the sense of still having a political career and still being in there. But I would have thought over time, you've got Tim Allen, you've got a whole new set of people coming into number 10. They do have to get on with the reset at some point. Will they be sort of saying to Keir, look, at some point, can we, even if she does survive, we might need to think about her role, because the words housing, houses, and Angela Rayner now have a very different connotation.
By the time we get to Monday's episode, we will know the direction of all of this. So tune in tomorrow for the special edition on Nigel Farage, but tune in to find out the future of the government when we return on Monday for Politics at Sam and Anne. It's going to be quite an intense weekend, so stay tuned and make sure you're there with us all the way through next week.
Well, I will see you just after Nigel Farage tomorrow, and podcast up as soon as we can afterwards.